My parents told my brother that he could take my house and I could just live in the camper in the backyard because I'm single and he has a wife and kids. I'll warn everyone here that this is going to be very long. So long that I'm splitting it into 2 posts and including a TLDR for each. I also really don't care who believes this. It's just so crazy that I don't blame anyone who calls BS. I won't argue about it, but this happened to me. I also really don't care if anyone in my family sees this. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything, but I'm also not going to reveal any details that clue anyone into who I am that doesn't already know me. I'm a single man in my early 30s. I've got a brother who's 29. And he's already got 4 kids. He had his first at 22 and the second followed a year later, then the third 2 years after that, and the fourth was the most recently born a couple of months ago. His wife, my sister-in-law, and I do not get along. She always tries to get a rise out of me by acting superior and turns into an extreme self-victimizing drama queen if I retaliate against her in any way. She can cry in an instant and put on an extremely convincing show to get sympathy from just about anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, even though they know exactly how she really is and just don't care. She's very good looking, I'll give her that, but she's so awful I could never be attracted to her. She also refuses to get any sort of job even though she has a college degree, and my mother willingly helps with the kids all day so their finances are entirely dependent on my brother. This also means that they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house, and privacy is a bit of an issue with all of them under one roof in a 3-bedroom house that was built in the 60s. Growing up, my younger brother was the obvious favorite. We're 3 years apart in age, but he developed a superiority complex because I was badly punished if I retaliated against his antics in any way. Back then, it was obvious my parents cared for him a lot more because he got the lion's share of everything, unless people called them out on it, which did happen a fair bit by other members of the family. This is why my parents packed us all up and moved us about 150 miles away from them, so they generally only would see us on holidays since it was a 3-hour drive. My brother got physically abusive towards me on a number of occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend to the point she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune I had. My parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit it was rather funny to see the looks on their faces whenever they had to treat me equal to my brother on birthdays and Christmas because other people were present. We had relatives that were very nosy and loved gossiping drama, so my parents did their best to hide what was really going on and threatened to take all my stuff away if I didn't keep my mouth shut. If anything, it just made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out because they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school yet when I moved out, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. I was low contact ever since leaving home. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but I really didn't care. From that point on, I would usually only see my parents and brother on holidays like the rest of the family. The start of the 2020 pandemic was not kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. It was a rented 2-bedroom condo that I really loved. As the lease was ending, my roommate left early to move back in with relatives, and I had to sell nearly all my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize to an extreme. I really shouldn't have rented a place that was so expensive, but I liked living the high life until that life wasn't kind to me. I realized I should have been living somewhere far cheaper. I could have saved more money to fall back on, but I had a plan. I own a truck simply because I've always loved trucks, so I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck. I could just live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living out of it far longer than I ever thought. I originally was hoping to be able to live out of the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still reside as well. But when I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they told me they had a full house and didn't want me there. Plus, we hadn't exactly gotten along in the past decade. They said they'd only agree to let me park my camper there if I paid them basically what it cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too much just to park my camper. I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I could find a new job. I may as well be living in an apartment with that rent price they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike since we couldn't come to an agreement. My sister-in-law thought it was absolutely hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined in, pointing and mocking me while calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck and camper in a store parking lot to sleep on the first night, but I had nowhere else to go. I felt scared out of my mind that someone might try and break in. Suffice to say, I didn't sleep well that night. There was nowhere else I could go, as any other relatives that owned houses were fairly far away, and all my friends were apartment people. I was pretty attached to my area as well, so I didn't want to just leave. I'd also had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment. It was the only way I could still get my mail anymore. Finding a stable place to park was pretty difficult. I went looking around, trying to find a job similar to my old one. It took months of living the nomadic camper life. In that time, I had to deal with a lot, everything from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding that I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone who told me to move claimed to be with an HOA. I wasn't even parked on the street with houses. When I questioned what HOA, they got incredibly belligerent and threatened me. I moved my camper anyway just to avoid the trouble. In order to have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know that's a crummy thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator would stay cold. I had a small solar power bank for recharging my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator. Generators are noisy and require fuel anyway, so I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to the neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail. I worked retail while in college and promised myself never again, though I was nearly ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money but had no stable place to live while receiving it. I didn't want to still be jobless when it ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind and had little else to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep note of where I could park and what public bathrooms I could use. I kind of envy the Japanese who have public bathhouses. We could really use stuff like that over here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back of the building by the warehouse in an old employee parking space literally no one else seemed to bother using because they were so far in the back that the area was borderline forgotten. My boss, the company owner, actually liked this arrangement because I was willingly available to take any shift I could get as long as I had enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I'm not exactly sure if this was legal, but no one bothered us about it the entire time I lived back there. I didn't have to deal with many trespassers. There were a few, but the security guards escorted them out. I was pretty much on call almost all the time when they needed me. I was working virtually every day of the week. My boss let me plug my camper into the building for power and water. I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office but the janitor and security guard. Beyond that, I usually had to shower at a friend's apartment or at my local gym as the camper didn't have a shower in it and only a portable toilet. I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is a nasty chore, so I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could go in to use the bathroom there at any hour. I was even on a first-name basis with the security guard. He's since become one of my closest friends. The camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater. Summers were not fun, though. The camper didn't have any AC, so I had to get a used portable air conditioner just to make it bearable. I made a lot of overtime pay and hands-on learned some new skills from other employees. Eventually, midway into this year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare I got from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to my work and, just 2 miles away, found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property. I managed to get it for $10,000 less than the asking price somehow. I used nearly my entire savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. It was enough space for me to back my truck in behind the house to take the camper off and set it up in the backyard. So I put it there as its own little building just in case I want to use it again. When I was fully settled into the house, I was dumb enough to brag about it on Facebook. My family saw the post, and that's where this mess really starts. After a few weeks, my parents, brother, and his family came to visit, completely unannounced, to have a tour of my home. I didn't even give them my address. Somehow they found out where I live. I still don't know how. None of my friends have fessed up, and no prior family members visited me before that. So I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home or something. It really wouldn't surprise me. Once I opened the door, they practically all shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists, and they started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around, and my sister-in-law had this creepy smirk that she was repeatedly flashing me. It was only later that I figured out why, and it made me madder than a bull on steroids that just got stung by a hornet. My parents were constantly talking about how I've got so much extra space now and it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. Sure, not now, but maybe someday. My brother kept remarking about how there was more space in our parents' house and how my house was closer to his job, too. Red flags all around, I know. Eventually, my brother asked to speak to me privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out on the front porch. That's when it finally made me realize they planned something. My brother, let's call him Dan for the sake of simplicity, said the house was too much for me alone and I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with kid number 4, and my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already have the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they live in the main house. I'd like to point out that Dan never once spoke of offering rent. Mind you, he's got a good job. He also started talking about how there would be changes and even curfews, and I couldn't just walk in any time without prior notice. If it weren't my brother, I would think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. But Dan lost his marbles long ago, thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way in hell I'd rent my house or parts of my house to him. Other people, maybe, just so I can pay the mortgage off more easily, but certainly not him or his nasty wife. I've heard this exact situation in videos online many times, and never once did I think I'd actually live it because I thought it was so ludicrous. But my parents, brother, and sister-in-law do all fit the bill for a bunch of narcissistic, entitled crazies. So I picked up my phone and set it to start recording and just held on to it. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I had done this and just sat there with his arms waving around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house. It went from saying that to acting like it was a done deal and trying to reach out his hand to shake mine. That's when I finally showed my backbone and said, "Hell no." I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled backward for a second. I rarely ever raised my voice to him on that level because I was punished by our parents whenever I did. But this was my house, not theirs. My spine can be as shiny as it wants here. I stood up and then told them that my house was not up for grabs and acting like I'll let him move in just because they want it won't make it happen. I bought my house for me. It's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without actually touching me and said I didn't deserve the house and he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed back in his face and said that was total nonsense because I worked hard to be able to buy my house. Of course, I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I had no wife or kids and I don't need all the space, so I may as well give it to him. I said I'm not giving him anything and he never even offered to pay me rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in my own house. Then Dan told me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first and our parents said I was going to do this and that I will. I yelled as if their word was law or something and told Dan that they did not have the right or power to give my house to him. Then, right on cue, my parents and sister-in-law barged back in through the front door and surrounded me to try and force me to agree. There was a lot of fighting, but to sum it up from this point on, I heard the line "just do it for Dan" way more times than I can remember. In the fight, I told them all they didn't have a say in my life or my house and to get out before I called the cops. Sister-in-law screamed the loudest at me about how she was pregnant again and I can't do this to her. I said I did nothing to her. She just assumed she could take it from me like I would just allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family and I called her a stuck-up jerk who never had any respect for me, so I didn't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. I have no sympathy for her. She won't be living in my house. Well, that made her angry enough to attack me. She got in one good hit on my face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back, kicking and screaming. She kept demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding recorded pretty much everything, so I held it up and said I was going to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Dan they were leaving. Then my mother said that I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I won't be and to not come back. I told sister-in-law that my phone recorded everything. If she tries anything, I'll press charges for assault. She screamed at me and stormed out, loudly crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and said that I better do this for Dan and sister-in-law. I responded by telling her I won't be. A week went by, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch, just like they said they would in the prior ultimatum. They rang my doorbell like crazy and also pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to shove their way in again, but I installed a couple of latch chains that prevented it, even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down and then, in a most sickly sweet tone, asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to get lost and never come back. My mother put on crocodile tears and asked me why I couldn't just do this for Dan because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and then bluntly said I do not love him as a brother because he treated me like crap for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They are terrible parents, and he's a terrible brother. Then I told them to leave or I'd be calling the police ASAP. They all left surprisingly easily, apart from my mother's loud crying and the others giving me dirty looks. One could say making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in the driveway. It was Dan and his family moving stuff in. He just waved to me with a crap-eating grin when I saw him. I was furious and told him and the rest of the family to stop, but sister-in-law smugly said to me, "Like it or not, we're moving in." And then, in the most fake way, while tilting her head and puckering her lips, she said that it was okay because my mommy allowed it, and I should always listen to what my mommy tells me. I seethed with rage just hearing those words and looking at her smug face. I locked myself in the truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, sister-in-law started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop and that I can't do this to her because she and Dan need the house. She cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I responded with, "Forget Dan. It's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard, thanks to the window being slightly open. I told sister-in-law if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her, and she was smart enough to retreat. When the police arrived, Dan and sister-in-law, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I told the cops what had happened as well as showing them my new driver's license that had my current address on it. Then we went to my front door. I saw they changed the lock, and the old lock was lying on the porch with the center of it drilled out, and the drill they used was lying right next to it with a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. Could they have been more stupid, leaving evidence out like that? I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown on all the events that happened prior. Well, I guess Dan called our parents over at some point after I arrived home because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and started saying that I'd agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie one way or the other. So Dan and sister-in-law finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they'd somehow outsmarted me. They had actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature was not on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them have actually seen my signature, so that was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Dan that was stupidly blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure that out. I don't think going to jail or court would do them any good. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages for anything of mine that was lost, stolen, or broken, and I'd call CPS too for good measure. Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all that, but my mother got between us and doubled down about how I should just do this for Dan and live in the damn camper so they can finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now or I'd press charges. I stated in a shout about how they drilled out my front door lock to break in. The police papers were obvious fakes, they badly forged my signature, and I've recorded video of sister-in-law attacking me. Those are felonies I could ruin their lives with if I wanted, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's kids, so they had one chance to get out. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they could not force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this, and she went over to sister-in-law and spoke with her quietly for a minute while my father spoke to Dan. Sister-in-law instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rent papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the paper bits or cite them for littering. Both of the cops at this point had the "I don't get paid enough for this" looks on their faces. Dan had to start telling the kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he wouldn't get his own room now. Sister-in-law and Dan gathered their kids up to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with the sad family routine. You know, where they all gather together in a sort of group hug while all facing one direction. I swear I think they practiced it beforehand. All the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths. Sister-in-law kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother just made the saddest face he possibly could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter and told them to keep packing. All the kids and sister-in-law turned up the crying to 11, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out." I ended up laughing like a maniac and retorting that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing, and no amount of crying will make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled jerk who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me like when we were kids. Dan started F-bombing me until the cops told him to cool it or be in cuffs regardless if I wanted to press charges. He sucked in his lips and looked like a mix of afraid and supremely upset. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law had all left, and they said they had no intention of going anywhere until this had been resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 cops became 4 as more drove in for whatever reason. That gave my parents some extra incentive to get moving. I made Dan give me the keys back to the new lock he put on my front door. I got another lock the next day anyway because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He was really reluctant to hand them over, and instead of handing them to me, he actually threw them down on the street and into a storm drain while saying to go and get them myself. But one of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off just to get at them, and he got pretty dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he just grumbled, then slammed them down into my hand. I told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this as if that were some kind of threat to me, and I voiced that to them. Then, in an overly sarcastic way, I said something along the lines of, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any holidays with you guys where I get treated like crap by you all anyway because Dan has always been your obvious favorite. He treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So do like you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you and suck it up." My parents were floored after I said all that, and the quartet of cops were looking pretty judgmental at them as well. I tell you, if you want to put nasty parents like mine on the spot, confront them in front of cops because they'll likely not try anything really stupid then. My mother just started crying and walking away. My father just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me, and Dan just held his kids in defeat. Oh, and sister-in-law was having a tantrum in my front lawn. Soon enough, they all formed a line, handed out boxes, and got their stuff out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it was all taken out pretty quickly. But while doing it, my mother kept saying it isn't too late. I could still do it for Dan several times, each time trying to bargain more and more to try and make me change my mind. She said that Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay. If that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them to let Dan rent my house so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes because I don't want Dan or his family around. I don't want his money, and I certainly don't want to live with him or my parents ever again. After the way they treated me when I was a kid, making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil to me. Sister-in-law ended up having another tantrum after hearing that and threw a box down and sat on the ground to have a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She just sat looking angry and sad there until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. So before they left, I laid into my parents one last time about all the crap they put me through growing up, and with 4 cops being right there, they couldn't do much other than stand there and take it for once. I called them out on so many things that happened and even pointed out how they just couldn't do something nice for me, like letting me stay over with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. How they let Dan and sister-in-law ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could stay in it free of charge. Yet when I needed a place to go, they wanted to gouge me for more than I could afford to offer to park my camper when they knew I was out of the job. There were more extremely judgmental stares from the cops when I said all of that, so I put my parents on the spot one more time and asked them what I ever did other than being born to deserve being treated so badly. Because when I finally have a bit of success in life, they want to snatch it away from me for their favorite child. Since they rather I give everything to Dan and have nothing for myself, I bought my house using the money that I earned. I owe them nothing, and I won't be asking anything from them ever again because clearly it will never be anything more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no answers from them. They just stood there looking like a fish out of water. So I continued ranting and asked them what in God's name made them think they were such good parents after all of that. My father was beet red, but more from embarrassment than anger this time, and my mother was crying that she was a horrible person. I bluntly agreed that she is a horrible person. They all are. I bet they all go to hell for it too. They were crappy people, and they all knew it. But if I'd called them out on all this stuff in private instead of public, they just get mad at me and still act like I'm in the wrong. They just kept that denial for so long that it became a part of who they are. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket to cry. My father looked more defeated than I've ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me entirely as they finished putting everything back into the moving truck. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen. Not that they had a chance to get much furniture yet. I was lucky to even have a couch at that time. They all got back in their vehicles, and sister-in-law just stood staring at me with malice until my brother finally got her to drive the minivan home. And as soon as they were all gone, I got back online again and spilled the beans with what happened. My parents were too embarrassed to even try and defend their actions this time. And while the family was somewhat split before this incident, it's now a landslide in my favor. Nearly all of the family has sided with me after this incident, and those who haven't simply aren't siding with anybody. No matter how much my parents previously tried the "we did it for Dan" line, no one listened anymore. Any remaining familial support they had is now gone. Many of the family who I expected wouldn't side with me did. That includes the former flying monkeys. So I guess they finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family at next Christmas Eve in my house. My parents were not invited. I wasn't blocked on my brother's and sister-in-law's profile, surprisingly, and I saw sister-in-law had a 4th baby in early November. They're still living with my parents. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if they can still guilt me. And I'm sure it's driving my mother and father up the wall because they aren't getting any peace and quiet in their old age with 3 rowdy, obnoxious kids, a mentally unstable sister-in-law, my golden child brother, and a newborn baby in the house all at once. Perhaps they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan take over the house completely. They might get some peace then. Yeah, they could do that for Dan. My parents and Dan showed up to Christmas at my house when they knew they were unwelcome. I was trying to keep things short, but I realized while compiling everything that part 2 was just too long. I've divided it into a part 3. For those who commented en masse to get cameras, I will when I can afford it. I'm still in financial recovery from buying a house last year, and as far as I know, good cameras need a decent computer to record too. I didn't have anything more than a 3-year-old laptop that runs Windows 10. Yes, I'm aware of doorbell cams. That will be the first kind I get. For those who kept saying that I should have just gotten my brother and sister-in-law arrested, the only reason I didn't was because they are parents. Their kids need them. If Dan was arrested, he'd likely lose his job, and without that, his family has no money, and sister-in-law has a month-old baby right now. Neither of them need to end up in jail. But you don't need jail for revenge. These can help, yes, but I got payback without filing a police report. Would I be this merciful again? More likely than not, and they know it. I decided to wait on making an account and posting until after the new year, just in case more stuff happened, and it did. As previous readers know, my sister-in-law was making passive-aggressive posts on social media that were obviously directed at me, especially after sister-in-law had her 4th baby in November. She was posting the same repetitive nonsense over and over again. She just found semi-clever ways of rewording it, but she pretty much just kept regurgitating that she was tired of living with my parents, that there isn't enough space, that she needs her own house, blah blah blah. I know I sound dismissive, but live through what I have with these people, and you'd be ready to sarcastically play tiny violins in front of them too. They're just that bad. And since I waited until January to make an account, more happened just like I thought. I stated before that I'd invited half the family for a Christmas Eve party at my house, and everyone I invited all came, even though it was a fairly long drive of around 3 to 4 hours for them. But they wanted to come and show me their support. I was praised by them a lot for how hard I'd worked to get a house on my own, that they were sorry for everything I'd gone through. I was asked why I just didn't take my camper and drive 3 hours back to them instead of living pretty much homeless for so long, and I had to sheepishly admit that I was very attached to living around here and I had my best employment opportunities in this area. My hometown doesn't have a lot of great job opportunities in my field, if any at all, and I wanted to make my own way as much as I could, an answer they overall accepted. We moved on to having a rather nice party, the best I'd been in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of great Christmas albums, and I have to say the one my uncle brought of Ray Charles was my favorite. He sings Christmas songs like no one else I've heard. It was a grand and happy time. I felt, for once, I could just forget my past issues and enjoy the moment. But I wouldn't be writing this if it had stayed that way. About 2 hours into the party, you know who showed up. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law popped in, trying to look all smiles. They didn't even knock, just walked right in my front door like they were meant to be there. I shut off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay and said they brought gifts. One of my uncles stood up and yelled at them before I got another chance to speak, and he said they don't deserve to be in my home after all the crap they tried to pull months earlier. And he was backed up by several other relatives. Mind you, this guy is my mother's brother, and he used to love her to pieces until he found out about the stuff that went on between me and my parents. My grandparents, mother's parents, as old as they are, finally got in between us and said to my parents that if they want to make amends with me, it's far too soon. And they've never been more disappointed in them than they were this past year. They'd hidden their favoritism for my brother from prying eyes for a long time, but no one was fooled anymore, and they needed to make a serious effort to try and actually treat me like a son if they ever want to be in my life again. Then they turned to Dan and sister-in-law and said they've seen the repetitive nonsense sister-in-law keeps posting about. They're tired of it and just let it go already. My house will not become their new home. Sister-in-law went back to her old standard of crying and had a pity party about how she should be the one living here and not me. She plopped down in a chair to have a tantrum and say it wasn't fair I got this house to myself when I have no family of my own and she has 4 kids that need more space, and she just wanted a better place to live and feel like a real mom. It was petty of me, but I loudly pointed out that she sucks as a mother because she lets my mother do most of the parenting while she sits on her butt all day drinking, playing on her phone, or going out and spending all of Dan's money, and she has the nerve to complain about it. I even joked that I'm surprised her baby doesn't get drunk from all her breast milk since she drinks so much booze, which I admit, I went a bit too far as I got some stares. And sister-in-law demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom. I said the evidence speaks for itself, and if she wanted to be able to afford to move out of my parents' house someday, then she needs to put her college degree to some use, get a job, and learn to save money. My mother already does most of the childcare for my brother's kids anyway, so she'd have plenty of time after her baby gets a little older. My brother's eldest kid, who's 7 years old, ran up to start kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mom, and he kept at me about how his mom said that I was a bad guy who made her cry and didn't let them live here. That's when my brother grabbed his son to pull him away, but all the other relatives jumped back in and this sort of turned into a family intervention against my sister-in-law and brother. She was crying, her new baby was crying, her kids were crying, and even Dan was nearly in tears from the verbal lashing he was being assaulted with. He ended up sitting on the ottoman I keep shoes in by the front door and looking like a complete wreck. He couldn't look anyone in the eye, he couldn't even say 2 words to me. That, with the whole house filled with angry people ready to judge him if he tried to let out his inner golden child again, if they weren't there to get his way. I bet this could have ended up as a repeat of when he tried to order me around to try and take my house months earlier. By this point, though, he'd been so thoroughly humiliated that his and my parents' reputation in the family was completely destroyed because the masks were all off now. Soon after, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law all left in defeat. The party resumed, and we all avoided speaking of what just happened for the rest of the evening. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed the night in my house. I even let some sleep in the camper so there'd be enough space. I admit it also makes a good guest house. My relatives all wanted a tour of it earlier as well, and they said they couldn't believe I'd been living in it for around 2 years. I got a lot of questions about it, like what summer and winter were like, and so on. I was up earlier than everyone else Christmas morning and had a fresh pot of coffee and some ibuprofen for those spiked eggnog hangovers a few of them had. I was complimented on being a way nicer host than my parents ever were, and we all agreed to do this again next Christmas. After Christmas, sister-in-law did finally stop making posts that were obvious digs at me and deleted all the old ones as well. But shortly after the new year, she more recently made a new post complaining about how she tried to convince my parents to get a camper like I did so it could be set up in the backyard so Dan and his family could use the whole house as their family home. Well, a taste of one's own medicine is never fun because my parents turned that idea down vehemently. No one is going to push them out of their own home, let alone their master bedroom. The post was only up for a couple of days before sister-in-law removed it, and she has hardly posted anything since then. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, can it still complain? Sister-in-law, I guess, has realized there's no point in doing it when no one hears her anymore, and Dan can't afford to move his family out on his salary alone anytime soon. If they end up expecting another child in the next few years, I won't be surprised. Things mellowed down for me since then. I've even invited friends over for a poker night. I suck at poker because I can never remember a thing about it, but so what? We get to drink beer and eat junk food while being merry idiots. We all loaded up on Whoppers from Burger King and just had it the best way all grown men can when they just want to have a good, unadulterated time and get drunk. I think maybe around summer I'll look into possibly dating someone. I'm not exactly getting younger here. Fingers crossed that goes well. My camper just sits idle in my yard now, and I admit there were some days I went out there just to spend some time in it. I did live in it for 2 years. It's like my second home, and maybe one day I'll actually get to use it for camping like it was meant to be. I've never been camping. My parents considered it a waste of time, so it'll be a completely new experience for me. This pretty much marks the end of what happened. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law have all been staying very clear of me. In fact, they seem to have gone back to acting like I don't exist, like they did before I bought the house. Not like that bothers me at all. It's better that way, but they're inevitably going to come back in some way. I know they will. I just wonder what kind of stupid thing they'll do next. If anything notable like this happens ever again, I'll make another post if this account is still active. My parents and Dan were back sooner than I thought, and they wanted money this time. This will not surprise some people who commented on my previous post because my parents did some of the exact things they said they would, which was wanting either my money or my signature. I did expect the classic lines of narcissists saying that I owe them or giving me some kind of socialist BS of sharing the wealth, but that was just my imagination running wild. The ensuing situation was somewhat similar to that but much more tame. I guess you could say they seemed to know not to push me too far now and were mostly aiming for pity. It began when my parents recently got in touch with me through social media and asked for a meeting in a public place of my choosing. It just screamed trap, but I wasn't afraid. In fact, I was amused. They know I'm not to be messed with anymore, so I could only wonder what they wanted this time. I picked a local restaurant that may have a name of an olive and a garden in it, and we met up there. Dan was with them, but he kept his mouth shut most of the time. We had awkward greetings, ordered some drinks, and then cut to the chase. My parents begged me to help Dan get his own apartment so he could finally move out. Apparently, Dan's credit isn't so great. Gee, I wonder why. Could it be his wife regularly spends him into a hole? Well, they asked that I help by either supporting some capital or by co-signing the apartment and helping pay the rent for it. I simply said no to both. That's when Dan spoke up in anger and yelled at me that I have so much and I don't have a family to support like he does. He needed my help. I should be sparing the money for his family since I don't have one myself. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed their help. Of course, that's right, they were pointing and laughing at me for being homeless. Or should we go further back to my childhood? I'd love to delve into that with plenty of ears to listen and around us. My mother grabbed my hand and begged me not to speak of any of it. My father and Dan both just looked away and said nothing. Pretty sure they wanted to say something like they used to at me but held their tongues. I asked them if they thought I was rich or something, and their look said it all. When I told them I don't have that kind of money, they looked at me like a deer in headlights. I broke it down about how much I'd managed to save for the down payment on my house and the way I had to live and work in order to save that much so fast, and how I spent nearly all of it on the down payment of my house. I'm still in financial recovery. I did have monthly income to spare, yes, but most of it was going right into my savings. I asked Dan what his yearly salary was, and when he told me, I pointed out that it was actually a bit higher than mine. I then loosely broke things down in rough math in front of them. About 70% of my income goes to my mortgage, insurance, gas, internet, phone, food, and other bills, and there's maybe 30% of that left at most that I can put into savings. I need that money saved to get back on my feet in time. I have to make sure I have all the savings to fall back on. My truck is from the 90s. If it were to break down, I'd need money to either fix or replace it. And there's other things that I would need a rainy day fund for, like home repairs, doctors, taxes, lawyers, or anything in general you need quick cash for when it's a sudden unexpected expense. So, as you can see, I just can't spare money for Dan, and I also refuse to co-sign for anything as that would leave me on the hook for any bill Dan couldn't or wouldn't pay. Then I pointed out that that's likely why my parents didn't co-sign for Dan's apartment themselves long ago, and my mother just started crying again. I was pretty much a step ahead of them in all of this. I'm not an ATM, and I'm not a fool, and I stated that right to their faces. I expected my father to become angry with me like he always does, but this time he was just, well, he didn't. I've known this man to explode on me for the slightest provocation of not enabling my brother all of my life, but this time he just didn't do that. It wasn't even a sneer on his face. The only way I could describe the look he had was regret and defeat. Maybe regret for being a crappy parent, or maybe regret because he can't bully me around anymore. Either way, my parents couldn't really argue with me, and I wasn't about to give them any money, and my father just got up and said that this was all just a waste of their time and that he was leaving. My mother started apologizing for him, but Dan still wanted to leave. Then, just to kill with kindness, I offered to buy them a round of unlimited soup and salad while we were all here. I guess they couldn't turn down free food since we hadn't ordered anything but drinks yet, and they stayed. I went out of my way to talk about anything other than money. Dan remained quiet and was either eating his food or looking at his phone, but my parents just awkwardly talked with me. They brought up that they recently joined a local Christian church and that they've already been going for the last 2 weeks. I said good for them, and they of course started trying to advertise that they'd like me to go too. I simply said no thanks, and they were smart enough not to push further. When the meal was finished, Dan left a $10 on the table for the tip and walked off without saying another word to me or anyone. My mother just excused his behavior, and we all parted ways. That was about it. Not as much drama as I thought there'd be, but this is still far better than how things used to be with my parents and brother. As for sister-in-law, well, she's been regularly complaining online about my parents. She really doesn't seem to like the fact that she's not queen bee of their house. I think her toxicity is finally getting to them. Why else would they be so desperate to come crawling back to me? Sister-in-law actually wants my parents to move into a camper like I had to in order to make space in the house, and she's being told no every time. She does seem to have a following of Karen-minded people like her, though, because here and there I get a message from someone I don't know that is intent on raging at me for not giving up my house for sister-in-law. I don't bother to argue with these people anymore. I just block and move on. Though there was one persistent troll who had my phone number and they called from a different number every time. Yes, it seems to be the same person who called me to say I need to make way for a real family man like Dan, but I could care less. The calls, though, seem to have slowed down, if not maybe stopped, because I made it clear to the person that they were only amusing me by keeping this up so long. The last time they called was around the beginning of the month. It's been silent from them since. Well, I figured I'd wait half a year or so after the original post to update everyone. It ended up being longer than that. Yes, things did go bad again, but not really for me. For the most part, I'm pretty much fine, if not almost unscathed since last Christmas. Apart from the time my parents and Dan came to me for money, as my last post told, and a more recent confrontation between me and my sister-in-law, you'll read about here. I did get a few cameras for my house, including a Ring doorbell in front. I didn't tell my family about the cameras just in case, but thus far, no one has attempted to break in. I think the way I outed them all before scared them into leaving me alone for the most part. Anyway, I've taken to renting out 2 of the rooms in my house, one to a close friend, the other to a friend of said close friend. Both have been fantastic tenants. They know to keep quiet and leave me alone most of the time, and even have small refrigerators they keep in their rooms so they don't need to keep any of their drinks in the main fridge. The deal I gave them on the rent was too good for them to pass up. It increased my monthly income as well, and even after taxes, I'm still monthly putting away some decent amounts in the bank since the rent money pays a good chunk of my monthly mortgage. You're all probably wondering how my parents, brother, and sister-in-law took to me renting out those rooms to friends. Well, the answer is not well. My father and Dan stayed out of it, but sister-in-law freaked out, which made my mother come crying to me over how I could have rented those rooms to Dan and his family instead. We had a bit of an argument in which I pointed out, for one thing, they freaking broke into my house before and tried to steal it. She wouldn't want to let someone who did that move in with her. Also, there wasn't enough room for me, Dan, and his entire family in my house. Not that I'd ever share a roof with him anyway. It's a 3-bedroom and a manufactured home, no less. After the master bedroom and its adjoining bathroom, that would have left only 2 small rooms for Dan, sister-in-law, and 4 kids. Not to mention, they'd be annoying as heck to me all the time. Also, she knows very well I can't be around sister-in-law because she intentionally antagonizes me, and they all mocked me when I was homeless before. Besides, my current tenants are both single guys in their 30s I get along with. My mother had some sobbing excuses for a while, but she finally let it go and admitted she was just desperate. Parents found out I was renting rooms out because sister-in-law basically stalked me in some way. Then she told my parents, and then parents contacted me, and then my mother came over to cry about it. Since then, parents haven't bothered me once about the house. So things are good for me. My parents and Dan, not so much. It turns out sister-in-law was a far worse person than I even thought. I already knew she was a gaslighting, self-victimizing drama queen, but she sank even lower, because Dan's youngest child turned out not to be his. Yeah, you read that all correctly. Sister-in-law had an affair, which in retrospect isn't all that surprising and something a few people here had totally called months ago. After being caught, sister-in-law was ousted from the family. Dan just recently finished with his divorce, which actually went in his favor since we thankfully live in an at-fault state. Dan also sued to get his name taken off the birth certificate of the youngest child and won. Pretty much any time he mentions her now, he just refers to her as that B word. That's ex-sister-in-law's nickname now. Ironically, this time together was the most bonding Dan and I have done in 15 years. While he didn't exactly apologize to me, he called himself a crappy human being with terrible taste in women and said I at least didn't make his mistakes. Despite all he previously did to me, he's still my younger brother. I couldn't risk letting him try to drive home. I told him to stay the night and managed to take his keys, then set up the bunk in my camper for him to use. I rented out my spare rooms. After all, he was in no shape to drive home, and if he had taken an Uber, he'd have to pay for it and then have to come back for his car later. He was still a depressed, crying mess, and I didn't want our parents or his kids to see him like that. And frankly, I was worried he'd do something insanely stupid if I let him leave. I didn't want him to sleep in the house, so putting him in the camper was the best option. Just because that witch screwed him over doesn't mean I suddenly trusted him. It was better for him to sleep it off in the camper. We both spent some time in the camper playing games and watching movies on my portable DVD player. Okay was no fun, it was just 2 people, and Old Maid was just boring. Thankfully, I had an Uno deck too and an old school battleship game. He really liked those. It was enough to keep him distracted until he was finally willing to lay down. After running out of whiskey, he threw up a lot in a bucket. Anyway, he was not opposed to sleeping in my camper. In fact, He found the idea cool and had a lot of questions for me on how I lived in the camper for so long as I did, and I answered them all, if not just to keep him busy, but I needed to go to bed myself since I had to be up early. So I left him with my portable DVD player and a couple of movies. That way, he could amuse himself alone for a while if he even managed to stay awake. Before leaving for work in the morning, I popped in while Dan was passed out in the bunk and left a bottle of ibuprofen and an energy drink on the counter of the camper's kitchenette, along with his car keys and a letter explaining to leave through the backyard gate. He saw himself out without trouble around 1:30 p.m. About a month after that, which was kicked out, Dan came to me asking to borrow my camper. I guess he found it more comfortable than I thought when he slept in it, and he fully admitted he didn't ask sooner out of pride. But with his soon-to-be ex-wife out of the house, he decided to give up his room for his eldest kid. He got 2 girls and a boy, with the boy being the eldest, now 8 years old. The kids were all forced to share a room until that point. They just had curtains up for the boy's half of the room, but the boy often slept on the couch to avoid his sisters. I know the poor kid was really desperate for his own room, so I guess Dan decided to finally make a better decision as a dad and came to see me in order to beg to borrow my camper so his son could have his room. If he could have afforded it, he'd have bought his own camper instead of relying on me, and he even said as much. I hadn't even gotten the chance to use the camper for actual camping yet, but I caved and let him use it since it was actually for a good cause, and he promised to buy his own in time anyway. No, I didn't ask for rent money for the camper. Dan is in enough of a financial hole as it is right now. Ex-sister-in-law and the divorce drained him. I've learned that I get far better results with family lately by not being spiteful. I loaded my camper up and put it down in my parents' backyard. My father put in a 30-amp breaker so it would have enough power for Dan to run heat and AC when he needs it. I do miss the camper. After all the time living in it, it kind of felt like it was part of me. The only reason I loaned it out was for the sake of Dan's kids. Pretty much the only reason I still do anything for my parents or Dan is for the sake of those kids, as I've bonded with them. And yes, I may not get the camper back for quite some time, and likely not in the condition I lent it out in, but I've warned Dan and my parents that they will be financially responsible for any damage they do to the camper as well as its upkeep for as long as they have it. I also took many timestamped pictures and videos of the camper inside and outside before lending it out so I can prove its condition before it left. Dan even recorded a video with me agreeing to my terms. That's as good as a contract. With the financial drain of the divorce, Dan's not going to be able to get a place of his own for years, I'll bet, though he seems to have no complaints about living in the camper at least. But I don't know if he actually likes it or if he's just putting up a front. But I guess it can remind him of the backyard forts we had as a kid since that's how it felt with me sometimes. Either way, he's living in it now. I did get some major props from the extended family for letting him borrow it too. I'm now referred to by a lot of them as the good brother Dan doesn't deserve. Either way, I think getting rid of sister-in-law was a great first step in mending the family as a whole. I still have little care for my brother and parents after the way they treated me all my life. I'm not going to let Dan's kids suffer for it. Those kids have actually really warmed up to me. They're actually happy to see me when I come over or when they visit me. I've even babysat a few times now that they don't have their mother's toxicity around. They've become much nicer kids, especially to me. I'm actually getting to enjoy being an uncle now. My mother is doing the bulk of the parenting for my nibblings, and she's been acting as nice as possible to stay on my good side. My father often looks very defeated in my presence, but otherwise, he's been either socially quiet or generally nice to me. He won't talk to me much, so that's leagues better than how he was before at least. Not letting my guard down either way. My parents do seem more happy that my ex-sister-in-law is gone, and they often say they don't know what they ever saw in her. My mother especially, because the two of them butted heads over who was mom in the house for a long time now. For the last part, at the same time as the divorce, Dan sued to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the baby that wasn't his. That witch didn't really want to change it because it meant no more child support from Dan if she did. However, there was a court-ordered paternity test for the man identified as the baby's father. I was prepared to laugh in case it turned out he wasn't the father either. But he was, and Dan's lawyer had a long talk with ex-sister-in-law's lawyer. Ex-sister-in-law has no leg to stand on, and Dan was ready to go back to make her situation even worse. She didn't have the finances to fight him any longer and agreed to change the birth certificate. The bronze-tongued lout who knocked her up did man up to take financial responsibility as a parent, but he ended up not staying with sister-in-law. He contacted Dan through his lawyer to tell him that he had broken up with that witch and that he wouldn't bother him again. I checked the social media of the guy after Dan linked me to it, and the lout was upset that now he's financially responsible for a child he never planned to have and that he's too young for this. The guy, from what Dan's lawyer was able to find out, is just over 40. He looks younger than he is, but he's by no means a young man. Shortly after, he put his online profile on private. Ex-sister-in-law did the same with hers a long time prior, so I have no information left to give. This may be the end. Sister-in-law is out of our hair. My parents and brother have finally made a real effort to be better people. I'm surprisingly happy as an uncle, and my house is still my house. Ex-sister-in-law saw my post and is mad she can't do anything about them. No surprise, ex-sister-in-law saw my Reddit post. She can't contact me about them in any way but with a lawyer, thanks to my restraining order against her. And she likely can't afford to get a lawyer right now anyway since the divorce financially drained her too. So she complained to Dan about it and demanded he'd tell me to delete my Reddit account. But not only has Dan read my recent post, he no longer cares. He said they serve as a reminder of the jerk he used to be, and he's not losing sleep about it. Besides, I've helped him out despite all he's done to me, so he's not going to be upset about it. My parents have also made sure to try and treat Dan and me more equally when I'm around too. My father is still a man of few words around me, though. Someone pointed out that changing now after so long of treating me as the opposite of Dan means he doesn't know how to connect with me anymore. And I think they are right. I don't mind the way he is now, though. My mother has also developed a habit of saying she's sorry about every little thing in my presence. Dan told me that she and my father have been reamed a lot by extended family and their counselor, and now my mother feels like she needs to apologize for everything. This is all a stark contrast to how they used to treat me. Also, I didn't talk about before what ex-sister-in-law's opinion was on Dan borrowing my camper so his son could have his and his ex-sister-in-law's old bedroom. But like a stereotypical bully, she looked down on him and mocked him about it because now he's living like a bum, as she put it. But Dan took it all in stride and asked if she was done yet because he knew this was exactly how she'd react, and he just plain doesn't care anymore. She's borderline dead to him, and her insults were on deaf ears. Then he pointed out to her that he was living out of a camper because he was putting his kids ahead of himself so his son could have his own room, something his ex never did despite being their mother. She just weaponized her children in pregnancy to keep from working and to emotionally blackmail everyone. Then he asked her to remind him how that was working out for her. Mind you, this was early on in their divorce. I'm sure you can guess her reaction. Dan said his ex did have quite the tantrum about my recent post, but no one has bothered to contact me on her behalf to take them down, so she just has to live with a well-deserved shame. She's been trying to act nicer to Dan lately. I guess the grass isn't so green living with her parents. Dan tolerates her as the mother of his children whenever they meet, but nothing more. He will never take her back. He's told me that he can never look at her like he used to, and the very thought of her turns him off emotionally. So ex-sister-in-law pretty much has no chance of reconciliation. I have no new info on ex-sister-in-law's affair partner. His social media is still locked down, same with ex-sister-in-law, and it's likely to remain that way as long as I have a chance of reading them. And that was pretty much the end. There was one more post, but it doesn't add too much info. My truck got egged on Halloween. It happened in the middle of the night / very early morning on the 1st. I suspect it was my ex-sister-in-law. The person my cameras recorded was wearing layers of heavy sweats and had their face wrapped up along with big glasses covering the eyes. You couldn't really tell if they were a man or a woman. They came on foot too, so no identifying a car. It did look about ex-sister-in-law's height, though, but that's not much in the way of evidence on its own. If it was ex-sister-in-law, she knew about my cameras, so covering her face and body for petty eggy revenge was probably the smartest thing she's done in years. Way to finally put her college degree to use by egging a beat-up old pickup truck. The egger showed up around 3 a.m. I was deep asleep and didn't hear anything. Whoever it was that appeared that night quickly threw a dozen eggs or so all over my truck. They didn't attempt to do any more damage at least and were gone in a flash as soon as the last egg was thrown. I didn't see the mess until I was leaving for work in the morning. I ran my truck through a local car wash during lunch break. That took most of the egg off. I had to scrub it a bit more later after work. Egg really isn't good for the paint, but the truck is from the 90s and doesn't exactly look mint anyway. I did take photos and filed a police report with the CCTV footage as evidence, but so far, nothing has come of it. There was no real damage other than my minor irritation and a few bucks at a car wash. If sister-in-law did do this, she was smart enough to only throw eggs and not key my paint or slash my tires so my insurance wouldn't be involved. I don't think much will come of the police report as the cops seem to dismiss it as a probable prank by a teenager. I guess they were probably overworked, but at least the report will keep a paper trail in case of future incidents. I waited till now to post because I wondered if anything else would happen, but no, just right back to peace and quiet. I'd appreciate any good advice on the matter, though, just in case something like this happens again. I asked around with some people on the street about cameras possibly seeing the person who egged my car. I got responses ranging from "we don't have cameras" to "it was Halloween and people pull stupid pranks, let it go." A few people who were helpful told me I waited way too long to ask and the footage auto-deleted, so basically the egger got away. But if it was sister-in-law, I'm guessing she had to walk around half a mile in those sweats just not to get a car spotted on camera or something. It wouldn't surprise me if she questioned if it was even worth the effort. Oh well, I guess I'll just wait to see if the egger comes back next year. I did hand out printed pictures of the egger, though, and even stapled a few up on posts so now people in my neighborhood are aware at least. The tenants renting out the 2 rooms in my house have stayed out of it. I don't really blame them. It's not their problem.